Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce you today to Ambassador Lamberto Zannier, who is currently the High Commissioner on National Minorities of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Ambassador Zannier served previously as Secretary General of the OSCE for 2 consecutive mandates. He was UN Special Representative for Kosovo and head of the United Nations Interim Administration Mission in Kosovo. And previous positions also include Director of the Conflict Prevention Center of the OSCE, representative of Italy to the Executive Council of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, chairperson of the negotiations on the adaptation of the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, head of disarmament, arms control and cooperative security at NATO, and with the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which he joined in 1978, he served in Rome, Abu Dhabi, and Vienna, specializing in multilateral affairs. I'm sure that our students understand, even from a cursory survey of this CV, that there are so many intersections between Ambassador Zannier's background and the work we do here at the school, in our degrees, in our PhD, that we should invite him for a whole course, not only for a lecture. Let me say, however, that today's event is not just a lecture, but is the most important yearly event in the life of our institution. The event in which the school gathers to remember its first director, Professor Ferdinando Targetti. Ferdinando Targetti, in my humble opinion, played a key role in shaping the school as an institution based on, one might say, revolutionary ideas, such as mutual understanding, openness, and frankness. As a young PhD candidate in legal studies, as I was then, I remember Professor Targetti as a very kind person, with a vibrant curiosity, always ready to share his views and interact with different disciplines and approaches. This is the core ideas here at the school. And I would like to give the floor to the brother of Professor Targetti for a more important, for some more important words.
Sì, mi scuso perché parlerò in italiano perché il mio inglese non è adeguato a quanto voglio dire. Intanto ringrazio la Scuola di Studi Internazionali di aver istituito e mantenuto in questi anni questa iniziativa della Targetti Lecture, in particolare il professor Fracasso e il professor Pertile, e naturalmente ringrazio anche per la sua presenza Lamberto Zannier. È una iniziativa questa della Lecture che consolida i rapporti di affetto e di amicizia tra la famiglia e gli amici di Ferdinando, i docenti e tutta la scuola, e in particolare i rapporti con la moglie di Ferdinando Borna, che ogni anno ha sempre partecipato e quest'anno non potrà essere presente, e che mi ha pregato di portarvi i saluti. Ferdinando Targetti ha lasciato un'eredità importante, e questa iniziativa, come dire, consolida l'eredità di Ferdinando Targetti, che ha fondato, che diciamo, è stato il promotore della Scuola di Studi Internazionali nel 2001, quindi 17 anni fa. In questi anni il mondo è cambiato, la globalizzazione ha modificato le economie, ha modificato la società, la natura delle democrazie, delle nostre stesse democrazie occidentali, quindi un periodo intenso, e Ferdinando Targetti pubblicò insieme al professor Fracasso nel 2008 Le sfide della globalizzazione, che è il suo testamento scientifico ed è anche, come dire, a mio avviso un punto importante, un riferimento importante per chi studia, chi approccia agli studi di economia internazionale. Ecco, però mi chiedevo che senso ha per degli studenti partecipare a una commemorazione, oltre naturalmente a sentire una lezione di grande interesse. Quale può essere l'interesse? Allora vorrei dire solo questo: la trasmissione dall'insegnante agli studenti è una trasmissione di sapere, di informazioni, ma soprattutto deve anche essere una trasmissione di valori, perché questi, i valori, consolidano il sapere, danno fondamento al sapere. Allora mi sforzerò di delineare con poche parole la figura morale di mio fratello Ferdinando Targetti. Era uno scienziato rigoroso. Scienziato rigoroso vuol dire che aveva delle convinzioni politiche e delle convinzioni scientifiche ben solide, ma non si esimeva mai dal verificarle rispetto all'evoluzione della realtà, rispetto ai dati, rispetto ad altri saperi. Era un intellettuale, non era un tecnico, era un intellettuale nel senso che utilizzava la propria conoscenza per dare un'interpretazione del mondo e costruiva relazioni con altri saperi per dare questa interpretazione. Era un intellettuale impegnato. Impegnato vuol dire che lavorava nella diffusione, nella promulgazione delle idee, era impegnato politicamente, è stato parlamentare tra il 96 e il 2001 con la sinistra, con l'Ulivo, ma faceva politica con lo stesso rigore, la stessa serietà col quale studiava e praticava la sua disciplina, cioè non sopportava le fumisterie e gli slogan. Era coraggioso, nel senso che sosteneva sempre le sue idee, anche se questo comportava, non lo aiutava nella carriera, che fosse politica o che fosse anche universitaria. Quindi il coraggio lo contraddistingueva. Potreste pensare che fosse una persona austera, un po' noiosa dopo queste mie considerazioni. No, era tutt'altro. Amava la vita, amava divertirsi, amava mangiare bene, amava viaggiare, e non era insensibile alle differenze di genere, come si direbbe oggi, e quindi metteva un'energia straordinaria nel vivere intensamente e nello stesso tempo nel fare seriamente sia la sua attività di docente che quella di politico. Ecco, mi viene da dire solo questo, mi scuso se mi sono prolungato troppo. Ferdinando trasmetteva questi valori agli studenti, alla famiglia, agli amici, e voi come studenti della Scuola di Studi Internazionali siete classe dirigente, siete un'elite. Se non lo siete lo sarete, e se non vi sentite o forse ancora classe dirigente, ma lo sarete. Ecco, oggi c'è un problema di rapporto tra le popolazioni, tra i cittadini e le classi dirigenti, le elite. Parlo delle elite che fondano la loro capacità sulla competenza. C'è diffidenza nei confronti della competenza. Questa diffidenza in parte è anche giustificata, perché le cose non vanno sempre bene. Però Ferdinando Targetti vi avrebbe detto se questa è la situazione, non chiudetevi soltanto nel sapere della vostra disciplina, non chiudetevi nella costruzione di una vostra personale carriera, che è importante, che è durissima, ma non basta. Impegnate il vostro sapere, il vostro ruolo di intellettuali nel migliorare la società secondo le vostre convinzioni. Questo sarebbe l'insegnamento di Ferdinando Targetti. E con questo vi ringrazio, e lui si sarebbe seduto molto volentieri a sentire l'ambasciatore Lamberto Zannier parlarci di minoranze, perché sarebbe stato un tema di grande interesse. Grazie ancora.
Thank you very much. The topic of today: conflict prevention through societal integration, insights into the work of the High Commissioner on National Minorities, is extremely important not only for the school, but for states and international relations as well. At the school we have had for years a course on minorities protection, held by Professor Wölke, who is now on leave, and it was highly appreciated by the students, and as soon as Professor Wölke comes back, we will have it again. But more importantly, I would say, in an epoch where majorities often claim an absolute right to govern, and migration is changing the demographic equilibrium of our societies, minority protection becomes even more fundamental in ensuring cohesion in pluriethnic societies. Minority protection is historically instrumental in ensuring the smooth functioning of our democracies. At the same time, minority protection within the state impedes the propagation of tensions at the interstate level. I think we have a number of examples, which I do not need to mention here. And therefore, minority protection is extremely important in the realm of international relations as well. So I'm delighted that Ambassador Zannier accepted our invitation, and also on behalf of the director of the school, Andrea Fracasso, who could not be here for serious personal reasons. I give him the floor without further ado. Thank you very much. We have some 45 to 1 hour for this lecture, and then there will be a Q&A session. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. The occasion, and actually what made it possible, is that tomorrow we will start in Milan an important for the OSCE Ministerial Council. This will be crowning the year of Italian chairmanship of the OSCE. We expect a number of high-level presences, foreign ministers, including the US and the Russian foreign minister. On the agenda, we will have complex issues such as the current crisis in the Azov Sea, more generally the problems revolving around Ukraine, but also some of the larger challenges, and all of this in a context where, unfortunately, the role of the multilateral tools and multilateral structures that we have developed over the years is losing traction. And this is even more unfortunate because some of the challenges that we face today are challenges of a global nature, challenges for which we need coordinated strategy that engage the international community as a whole. And we see increasingly the impact of geopolitics. We see within our own societies tendencies prevail towards renationalization of foreign policies, and so we see a tendency to go towards deals about everything as opposed to coherent strategies, and this is not good news in terms of our ability to improve global governance and to improve our capacity to tackle some of the complex challenges that we have in front of us. I would like to start with a few words about the OSCE and the method, also the organization. You will be familiar, I hope, with the OSCE as an organization as such. If you take a look at it, you will see that the definition is that the OSCE is the largest regional security organization. It stretches, as we used to say, from Vancouver to Vladivostok. It comes from the CSC, which was a political process created in the 70s to establish a space of dialogue between enemies at the time. This was a platform for engagement between NATO and the Warsaw Pact at the time during the Cold War, with the facilitation of a number of neutral and non-aligned actors. There were the other European countries that were not part of one or the other military alliance. So after the end of the Cold War, this approach remained. The organization became better structured, but it also had to change to tackle the new kind of problems that arose with the new world order prevailing after the end of the Cold War, and that's where my office, the office of the High Commissioner, comes from. In the early 90s, as part of the institutionalization, one of the problems that we immediately picked up, or we as the international regional community immediately picked up, was the fact that new borders were arising as a result of the collapse of former Yugoslavia, Soviet Union, the new conflicts arising. And these new borders were replacing previous administrative borders that over the years have been freely changed by leaders of these countries. Professor Pertile was mentioning my job in Kosovo. I remember when I was in Kosovo, one of the rather intractable problems I had to deal with was the so-called northern municipalities, which are municipalities that are almost entirely inhabited by Kosovo Serb communities, which were never really fully integrated in let's say the governance structures of that province. So when Kosovo declared independence, those provinces were caught into this space, unrecognized by Serbia, and the pushback, even though there was a certain level of mixed population. Remember, my own personal assistant in Kosovo, she was a Kosovo Albanian from North Mitrovica, and she was telling me in a way, good relationship, good neighborly relations between Serbs and Albanians, even in the north. After the declaration of independence, this changed, and many of the Albanians left, etc. But what I also found out is that I think in the early 60s, Tito at the time was concerned, looking at this Kosovo region, at the constant change of the demographic balance, with the quota of Albanians in the composition of population of the region growing. So he decided to change the administrative border, and he added some municipalities from from central Serbia to this Kosovo region. And so those municipalities never really made much of it. It was a change of administrative borders. But when Kosovo declared independence, they got caught into this, and they started saying we don't belong there, and they really pushed back. And this is an issue. You may have heard that there is talk even about changing of borders, which is, by the way, a wrong way of putting it, because Serbia still doesn't recognize those boundary lines as borders. Neither does the UN, which has still a resolution dealing with that. So this is particularly controversial issue. But I'm saying this to give you a flavor of the difficulty that a transition from an administrative border to an international border can create with the population. And in many cases, this created conflicts. There are places in the OSCE space like Abkhazia or Transnistria or South Ossetia or Nagorno-Karabakh, where there is either ongoing conflict or a situation of a frozen conflict, because we managed through various mechanisms to create an environment that manages to control in a way the situation, and to launch political processes that are very protracted, because some of these conflicts are almost intractable, but at least allow us to wait until maybe a moment comes where we can really find the necessary ingredients to try to solve these situations in various ways. For instance, in the case of Kosovo, to go back, that is the idea of a European perspective. If Serbia joins the European Union, and Kosovo hopefully also finds a way to be better recognized, including by European Union members, by all European Union members, then also Kosovo might benefit from that, and that joint movement can create the necessary traction to solve the remaining problems. So in a way, also from a UN perspective, I saw that the EU horizon could have been one factor that would allow the solution of this rather intractable problem. So the fact that this internationalization of borders divided communities and created new minorities at the time, but now some of them are pretty well established, also raised the issue of a mechanism that was needed to monitor, to issue early warnings, and to prevent conflict arising from this kind of situations. So my mandate as a High Commissioner, and I'm now the fifth High Commissioner in line. The first one was the former Dutch Foreign Minister, who is in a way considered still today the father of this office. Is a mandate of conflict prevention, not necessarily minority protection. And something we have learned, and just to maybe to start off on this side, that while, yes, the protection of minority rights is important, and it's certainly one of the tools that we use and to monitor, but also to engage with the countries. The story doesn't end there, but there always has to be a balance. Sometimes minorities have expectations. They go well beyond this notion of balance and this notion of investing in a process of gradual integration of minorities in the country where they live, while ensuring that there is a mechanism of safeguard of their identity and protection of their rights, of course. So this balance between protecting the minority, but also ensuring that the minority and the protection of minority doesn't in any way affect the rights of the majority, so there has to be that. And secondly, also the need to make sure that this gradual process of integration results into an enrichment of the society as a whole. A diverse society is a richer society, where everybody, with his own perspective, with his own cultural background, contributes to achieving the same goals. But this doesn't mean that the differences should be cancelled in some way. So this is where the minority protection mechanisms kick in and need to be monitored and to be kept alive. So over the years, we have been, and my predecessors and myself have been engaging in this sensitive process of monitoring and engagement on the basis of a methodology that is typically of the conflict prevention based fundamentally on quiet diplomacy. So it's usually low-key interventions with high-level representatives of governments, but also with the civil society and with the representatives of the minorities, to try to identify what are the difficult issues and to address them behind closed doors, behind the scenes, and avoiding too much noise, to also make sure that in a way the role of the international community is not hijacked by one or the other players and then splattered on the front pages of the papers, making then issues more intractable. And this has happened also to me in my job. Sometimes I engage with the government, and then as soon as I leave the meeting with the minister, I find out there's a press statement where the minister talks about our meetings and puts his views as in a way the center topic of discussion, which immediately complicates my life with the representatives of the minorities, or sometimes also with representatives of the so-called king state, which is a state of reference of that minority. That is the other complicating element, the interaction. That's also very much part of the things that I do. Bilateral relations, especially in this phase where they're becoming more polarized as a result of the overall polarization of the international environment, often take minorities as hostages, and I see minorities used by governments to score points or to put pressure on neighboring governments. I'm in this the first foreign minister with whom I will have a bilateral tomorrow in Milan will be the Hungarian foreign minister, with whom we are discussing issues relating to the status of the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. And Hungary in this moment is blocking the dialogue of Ukraine with NATO, with the European Union, because of these issues related to minority, because of maybe a larger set of considerations, but certainly the key tool is revolving around that. Of course, this is for Ukraine particularly important, especially in this moment when Ukraine really looks at NATO with great interest, given the ongoing crisis with Russia, and where even Hungary had to, in a way, lower a little bit the level of their own opposition. But this issue of the minority, especially in one region which is called Zakarpattia or Transcarpathia, which I visited a few months ago, it's quite sensitive and quite difficult to handle. Basically, there are, as the Hungarians put it, acquired rights by their minority there. Visiting this region, I saw a number of Hungarian villages. In fact, what you see, and this is what we call the territorial based minorities. Minorities have a strong concentration on a relatively well-defined territory. You have entire villages that are almost entirely populated by members of the Hungarian minority, where schools are in Hungarian language, where you see Hungarian flags in front of the schools or inside the schools, where virtually nobody speaks Ukrainian. Most of the people speak Russian, and that's in a way the legacy of the Soviet Union. And suddenly the Ukrainians, as they are really striving to strengthen, also as a result of the conflict they're going through, to strengthen their own identity, and in an atmosphere where there's a lot of how can I say, references to need to show patriotism, and where there is a strong drive of the national forces also in the parliament, in the Ukrainian Rada, and where some of the tools that are now being developed have to do with education, so promotion of the Ukrainian language, the use of language itself. There is a concept on ethno-national identity that is being developed. So the fact that there are pockets of minorities that are very distant from the Ukrainian culture, the language, and in fact there is even a sense of a pushback, which I cannot deny myself, having been there. I'll give you a couple of examples. As I say, I visited these regions, I visited the schools, and I saw this problem. And both in the schools and also in the municipal buildings, one of the things I noticed was clocks on the walls, where the time was not the Ukrainian time, it was the Hungarian time. So this created problems here making an appointment, because they will currently use the Hungarian time. So this tells you a lot about where they see themselves. So they happen to be in Ukraine, but they created a space around themselves. And this has been like this for centuries. So they say, these are acquired rights that we have, and we don't want to give them away. We have schools, we have private schools, there are universities in Hungary. But of course, those kids that go through the schools in Hungarian with a limited, if at all, knowledge of Ukrainian language, have close to zero perspective of integration in the Ukrainian society, but they live in Ukraine. So in a way, the Ukrainians have a legitimate expectations that things can change, that the Ukrainian language will be introduced also there. And that in a way also there is a path of integration for the younger generations, at least, in the society. Of course, the way this is implemented creates in itself a big problem, because the Ukrainians want to see results tomorrow. So they are issuing decrees saying, as of tomorrow, as of next month, all courses will have to be in Ukrainian, and the Hungarians saying, where are the teachers, where are the books, plus, we don't want to do it in that way. We want to, our identities to be safeguarded, preserved. So this results in a major problem within the two. Now the Hungarians have put forward that they shared with me a copy of a possible agreement, bilateral agreement, which is the way I would like to see it happen, because the obvious way is that the two sides sit around the table. There are, in many cases, joint commissions. In fact, they have a joint commission also between Ukraine and Hungary, but they couldn't even agree on the minutes of their last meeting because it was so controversial that they are not even meeting again until there is an agreement on what they decided last time, which is, if you talk to the two sides, you will hear two very, very different stories. So this is the space where also the role of the international community, the role of institutions like mine, come in and to try to talk to the two sides and to see if we can create a little bit of space for them to move closer to each other. But at the time, and you can imagine both in Hungary and in Ukraine we have elections coming up, this is not the best time for anybody to show flexibility and to show, how can I say, availability to make concessions on issues that are so central and so politically sensitive. One of the problems we saw in Ukraine, for instance, and this is what initially created also this question with Hungary, but also with other minorities, that there was a law on education that was adopted roughly a year ago, just over a year ago. And we had been working, my experts had been working with the Ministry of Education. Education, I should say in brackets, has become for me, strangely enough, I was surprised myself when I discovered that, but it's a priority. I'm working on education everywhere because some of the problems we face come out of the structures of educational systems and the way also the schools affect and address the issue of integration of minorities. And in some cases, schools do produce segregation in societies, but we'll come to that in a minute. So this law, we work with the Ministry of Education, and the law that went to the Parliament was all in all balanced enough, and it was going in the direction of introducing the teaching of the Ukrainian language, but with due attention to the problems of the minorities, so maintaining minority language teaching, but with certain quotas, with certain proportions, so in a way achieving the two things. But when the draft law reached the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, this was changed. And some provisions were introduced to put much more emphasis on the use of the Ukrainian language and to reduce the space for minority languages. So this became a political action. So we tried then, and this went to the Venice Commission. The Venice Commission had, in fact, objections to this. So we used that also to try to put pressure on the Ukrainians to as they come to the implementation, because they are unwilling to review the law, and probably the government doesn't have the numbers even in parliament to try to do that. But this would be seen as non-patriotic if they went in that direction. So we have to live with that law and maybe look through the implementing legislation whether some of the distortions introduced by the law can be corrected. So we've been working with them, and we're still working with them on that. But the problem is that even the implementing legislation will have to go to the Rada, to the Parliament, and so the risk is that what happened to the initial law will happen also to subsequent implementing laws, and then this problem will never go away. And this is the environment in which we are operating today. That's why I started off with a larger picture. In this more polarized environment, the space to operate for the international community is becoming much more limited, and it is more difficult to make a difference because of the political considerations. And this goes back to some of the problems that we find a bit everywhere, including here in Italy. Diversity in the societies is in a way creating a pushback by majorities. Societies are growing more diverse. We are in fact now starting talking about new minorities. And it's interesting that as I focus on new minorities, that of course the impact of migration on our societies. And migration to me, and as I look at it, it's not, how can I say, a transitional problem. We had the acute crisis with Syria and whatever. But it's our future. It is a problem of global governance. It is linked to so many things. It's linked to conflict, it's linked to climate change, it's linked to demographics. It's linked to some of the long-term trends that we face in the evolution of humanity. And that's where, to go back to what I was saying earlier, we need these global strategies. And we need shared strategies. And unfortunately, we see that some of the key players, key players are backing out of these tools. But they are backing out also because, in a way, they are backed by their societies. They have been elected. And so this should make us worry, because we see that there are societies, and we see it now today in France. In France, it's not only that, there's much more than just that. But there is also, in the bunch of signals we are getting from the protesters wearing the yellow jackets on the Champs-Élysées, one of the ingredients of that protest is also a pushback against policies that go in the direction of saying we need to implement global strategy that will be difficult and unpopular strategies for us to perform. So societies are pushing back, and societies are pushing back, including by and through a very polarized debate internally, and by, in a way, electing leaders with whom it is more difficult to interact, and with whom it's more difficult to discuss these various issues. So we have set there is a mechanism created there that has a kind of a perverse action, because then, like I was saying, in the case of Ukraine and Hungary, it is more difficult for me to engage and to find a reasonable solution in this more polarized environment. So let's go back one moment to education. We had a month ago in The Hague. We have every 2 years a big award that we give to individuals or organizations that have distinguished themselves for improving the conditions of minorities. And this year we decided to do something different. We didn't pick an organization, we picked a group of young people, a group of students from a small center in Bosnia and Herzegovina called Jajce. It's actually an old capital of Bosnia, where there are different communities living today peacefully, but where the distortions created and introduced by the Dayton Peace Accords, and don't take this as a criticism of Dayton Peace Accords, like Ohrid in Macedonia, or in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, I should say, until they come up with a new name. These accords created peace by separating the communities. And in Bosnia, this happened in a very sophisticated way, because it's the entities and the federation, the Republika Srpska, the cantons, and there's a system, there's a very segregated system, very carefully designed and extremely complicated. If I deal with education systems and education policies in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I have to talk to 7 different ministers. At the level, federal level, or the country level, and then a canton level, and the entities, etc. And the policies should be, in a way, accepted by all at every level. So it is extremely difficult to operate. But so one of the results, going back to the area of education, or the consequences of this of the Dayton Accord, was the creation of schools trying to bring kids from different communities that had fought against each other during the war, to bring them back together to the same schools. And of course, there was a realization that it was difficult to have them study in the same class, even with the differences they had on interpreting the facts of the war. And so they were each other as still enemies. So what was created in many areas where there were diverse communities living together was the notion of 2 schools under one roof, which looks good because all kids go to the same building. But then if you are a Bosniak, you enter the school and turn left, and if you are a Croat, for instance, you enter school and go right. And the difference doesn't finish there, because then you have a different curriculum. and you study history in a different way. And then the result of the course of the education is that you will look at the guy studying in the other wing of the school as very different from you, and actually they are the ones who created the problem, and of course this is reciprocal. So this is a system that has worked in the beginning to bring them all together, but it's not really effective. So what we need to do is to create joint classes where they study all together, where they can have some subjects separate, whether it's religion or even history we can discuss. But where other, and most of the subjects are studied together and where they grow together. So in this village, in Jajce, or in this small city, at some point the authorities decided to open a new professional school under the system of 2 schools under one roof. It was Bosniak and Croat students. And the students who had been used in the lower course of studies to study together went out to the streets and started demonstrating, saying, we don't want to be separated, we want to study together with our friends. And they did that against the will of the authorities, against the families. The families were encouraging, in a way, them to accept the system, which was good for you. And it has worked, so what's wrong with it? And the kids went and kept protesting. In the end, some teachers sided with them, and finally they prevailed. And so, in fact, the new school was opened, but it was a mixed school, where still the Bosniaks and the Croats had some subjects separate, but were studying together. And this was a great symbolic result. It made the front pages of local newspapers and all that. But we decided to raise the profile of this even more. So we gave the award to the students. We invited the student council and the representative of the student council. We gave them also a nice packet of money that we gave them. But what was more important was really, and the money we discussed with them, they'll invest it in the school and to improve the school structure. So it's also, they won't go on holiday with that, but they will use it to improve even more the conditions of the students there. So it's a nice example of how the international community can assist, but where the ownership and the initiative of the people, and this is where also the role of youth in this society, where sometimes some of the old schemes, how can I say, continue to persist and continue to keep things complicated, needs to be encouraged. Young people are the ones who have a better vision of the problems or the challenges of the future. And I think, and I'm certainly one of those who want to empower young people to give them a stronger role in the society when we see this pushback. So I thought this was a good example also to mention to you, being ourselves also in an academic environment, and mentioning the role of education. Education for us has to help the constructions, the building of a society that is balanced and well integrated. As I said at the beginning, everybody should be able to play a role in that society, accepting the differences, but also accepting that no walls should be there within that society, for the society to be functional and effective. So education is certainly the first step. We have programs that we started, and we are investing more and more in these, to promote multilingual education. And we have a regional program in Central Asia, for instance, where societies, there, if you go, Central Asia for us is the former Soviet Central Asia, the so-called STANs, which the OSCE inherited as legacy of the Soviet Union, in a way, engagement in the organization. And it's a very interesting part of the world, but where you see that even there the borders are artificial and the societies are very multi-ethnic in a way, and this multi-ethnicity should not be suppressed in a way, and so this multilingual education is so important in places like this. But with the polarization, what we have seen, and especially with this increasing confrontation between Russia and the West, and if you want, we can talk about more about that also from other angles, also from a security perspective. You will have seen now NATO just made a statement on Russian violation of the INF treaty yesterday or the day before. So this is another step in the development or in dismantling the system of safeties, in a way, that guarantee the stable relationship, even though still in a confrontational and antagonistic mode between Russia and the West. We never managed. I have to say, with regret, I'm sorry if I move away, I'll come back to the minorities, but this is also in the background of it. We never managed to overcome, in a way, the antagonistic relationship and the nature of the antagonistic relationship between Russia and the West. I saw that when I served in NATO. I spent 6 years in the 90s in NATO. I started in 91, and when I started, the Soviet Union still existed. And I saw the end and the collapse of the Soviet Union from a NATO meeting room. And I saw it live when the Soviet ambassador declared in 2 weeks the Soviet Union will cease to exist. And that was quite a historical moment, leaving it in NATO. But that was the beginning of a new phase, and the debate. What next? Are we closing down? Are we expanding? Are we developing a dialogue with Russia and all that? And actually there were some who were saying, if we manage in NATO to develop a decent and a strong relationship, maybe even a partnership with Russia, we have solved every security problem in Europe. But then it was much easier to move in the direction of saying, well, let's take it in steps, and now that the new Eastern European countries are liberated in a way from a Soviet oppression, it's much easier to go there, to reach out, to make them members, etc. But all that happened in a way that created increasingly or strengthened the antagonistic relationship with Russia, because it was not counterbalanced by a strong Russia strategy within NATO. And then what we have seen in recent years, both competition at the international on the international how do we call it, scene between the United States, European Union, and Russia itself, in places like the Middle East, for instance, or other regions. Also the changing nature of multipolar relations, also in the UN, in a way, with other players emerging more strongly. All this, in fact, had an impact on this relationship. But when it comes to the NATO-Russia relationship, the steps have always gone in the direction of lowering the level of safeties that we had built, especially in the last phase of the Cold War. The ABM treaty. Now the INF is quite worrying for us Europeans in particular, because the INF was really looking at weapon systems that could target Western Europe. And the Americans are less interested because they have less of a military presence in Europe compared to what was the case during the Cold War. But we Europeans should really take this much more seriously, and I'm not sure we are doing that. But the net result, and also taking into account the initiatives that NATO has taken in terms of anti-missile defenses built in Europe, which created issues in the relationship with Russia, increased in a way the level of confrontation between the two. I was, as I served as Secretary General, one of the last events I attended was the Moscow Defense Conference, a conference which I attended 2 or 3 times, that was and still is boycotted by the West, so I was one of the few Westerners there. And I was on a very high-level panel there. I was speaking as Secretary General of the OSCE. And I was together with a Belarusian Minister of Defense, a number of other high-level politicians from countries friendly to Russia. But the really interesting speaker there was General Gerasimov, who was the chief of staff of Russian armed forces. And he presented a chart basically showing NATO installations. And his conclusion was, look, we are surrounded. NATO in Turkey, NATO in Romania, NATO in Poland, NATO in the Baltics. This is getting worse. We need to react to this situation. So there is a perception in the West that Russia is acting aggressively, that is modernizing its forces, etc. There is a perception in Russia that they need to do that because the West is increasing its own pressure and its own presence. The Crimea issue, I remember discussing it with some Russians when it happened. And of course, there are all sorts of considerations there. First of all, the Russians will say it's them who have declared independence or they separated themselves from Ukraine. Even there, in Ukrainian times, actually in 94, Italy had the chairmanship of the OSCE. And in 94, Italy opened an office in Simferopol in Crimea, because there was a concern that Crimea could become a separatist region similar to Abkhazia or Transnistria, because there were separatist trends, because the Crimean population was heavily Russophone, and the number of Ukrainians there was in a way relatively limited. It was the Ukrainians themselves, after a few years, who moved us to close that office, us as the OSCE, to close that office and go to Kiev saying Crimea is not an issue anymore, they have a special autonomy, there's a local parliament, etc. Which shows that there was, in a way, a degree of tendency of Crimea towards some kind of stronger autonomy on separatism. But then we all saw on television the little green man that went in, so obviously there was a substantial support, external support for this separatist tendency going there. But I'm saying all this because beyond history and these considerations, when the Russians saw that in Ukraine the nationalist forces were increasingly prevailing, and then one of the key policies, and now they want to put it in the constitution itself, is the integration in European structures, including in NATO. For the Russians, Crimea being taken over by NATO, including Sevastopol, which is the historic military basis, would have been a total disaster. So in a way, it was a preemptive move to make sure that if Ukraine moves to a closer relationship with NATO, this does not interfere with the Russian strategic objective of remaining a key player and present in the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and all that, for which Sevastopol is a key element. So that shows that behind these things, and it's all speculations, of course, based on things we have seen and we have heard. But then this shows how complicated this relationship has become and how difficult it is to address issues. So if I translate this into things that I'm engaging beyond Crimea, where I could talk about the Tatars, and if you're interested, we can have a discussion about that. It is also the narrative that goes behind this. One of the things that really disturbed very heavily the relationship between Russia and Ukraine recently has been the decision by the Orthodox Church, by the Patriarch in Constantinople, the Constantinople Patriarch, to authorize or to recognize the autarchic, what it's called, autocephalous Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So a divorce from the Patriarch in Moscow. In a way, the Church was always a very strong factor of influence of Russia in Ukraine. The Ukrainians saw that. And so they really invested in trying to become independent from the Moscow Patriarchate. But this, for the Russians, was outrageous. was totally outrageous. So this was another element that contributed to make the crisis between the two even more bitter in a way, and things more intractable. Now, one of the things I'm seeing is that the Russian communities living in a number of countries neighboring Russia, also because of this increasingly antagonistic environment, are becoming more and more politicized. And this goes beyond the issue of, how can I say, the problem of their day-to-day integration. On the one hand, there are laws being passed. I mentioned the one in Ukraine, in the Baltic states, in particular in Latvia. There's been a change of legislation, which was rather permissive vis-à-vis the Russian community. They had quite a right to study the young people in Russian language, with elements of Latvian language being introduced. But based on what my experts tell me, the system was a good one, because at the end of the is it the 12th grade, when there is an exam to have access to the university, 90% or over 90% of the Russian language students were choosing the Latvian language for the state exam to access the university, and they were passing the Latvian language. So the school was, yes, in Russian, but was preparing well the students in Latvian. Now the new law has reduced dramatically the number of hours in Russian language, basically leaving it language and literature, and everything else is in Latvian. And the Russian community has reacted to that. There's been protests in the streets. I spoke to the Latvians, say, well, these are always the usual extremists. In fact, the majority of the population is okay with that. But then there were elections, and in fact, the largest party in Latvia now is the pro-Russian party, or the party that represents the Russian community, led by the mayor of Riga, who is also of Russian ethnic origin. And this is giving the Latvians quite a problem. They still have to set up the government, and they don't want this party to be in the government, so trying to have a coalition of Latvian parties, and ignoring this majority, this largest party, which is say the Russian one. But then this will increase the divisions in the society. But beyond that, what I'm discovering, or I'm seeing, is that there is also a narrative that goes with all this, that is becoming increasingly difficult and polarized. And this has to do with what a cluster of issues that go under perhaps the rubric of memory politics, I would call it like this. And I see this everywhere. I was mentioning the Hungarian schools earlier with the Hungarian flag. Symbols, flags, monuments, statues, names of streets, but also the interpretation of history itself. History, as we know, there isn't a single history. There's every country has its own history. Every country chooses to highlight certain pages of history and maybe forget some other pages. But if you put it in a broader context and you look at a region, those who are heroes for some may be criminals for others. Those who won and see a certain moment, we will have next year's a celebration of the Trianon Treaty. And in Romania, there will be huge celebrations of the founding of the Romanian state. But for the very substantial Hungarian minority living in Ukrainian, this will be a day of mourning or close to that. So I'm telling the Romanians, don't overdo it. Don't humiliate part of your society. Make them feel comfortable with this. But certainly history, and going back to Latvia, the Russians there, and also the way they study history in their schools, for them, the key event that dominates the last century is the result of the Great Patriotic War, where they defeated fascism and Nazism and reestablished in a way freedom in a number of countries that were oppressed by the fascist opponents. The Latvians see it totally the other way. And in a way say, well, we fought for our liberation, we were helped, yes, but we finally achieved our independence, and then the Soviets came in and they took over again, and they sent our fathers to Siberia or whatever. So this narrative is so different and so opposed. There was a case recently, a debate actually between the Latvian foreign minister, Linkevicius, and Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, because the Latvians finally discovered the bones, the rests of a hero, a patriot, they consider. In fact, they said he was almost the head of the country because he was heading the only movement of resistance against the Soviet invaders in 44, 45. And he fought until after the end of the war. He fought against the Soviets to try to free his country from the Soviet oppression. And they were hiding in the woods, and they had a regiment there, and until they were caught, and then they were all killed, and he was also killed. So they discovered that there was a very formal reburial, and with a very strong symbolism around this, the symbol of freedom. And the Russians immediately reacting, saying, we can't let the Latvians rewrite history. And this was, we were there to liberate Latvia, and Lithuania, I'm talking about Lithuania. And the Lithuanians were saying, but who liberated whom? We disagree. And so this shows how history can be. And to go back to the schools in Bosnia, we see the same there. And in the Balkans, we usually say that the Balkans have produced much more history that they can digest, and probably this applies to the whole of Europe. But this is something we need somehow to deal with. And in fact, as I told the members of the OSCE, they start looking into this. Everybody got very nervous because they don't like to go there, and they don't like to have that debate. But sometimes I think that we really need to do this. And I'm working with a group of historians to advise me what can be done to address this kind of problems. And one of the answers I got is that there is increasingly a notion of multi-perspective history. Basically, you shouldn't give up your way of teaching history, and that's totally, fair that you have your own also identity based on your own interpretation of your history. But then you should not use that to shut out everybody else. You should really understand that there are other ways to interpret the same facts, that other people do it in a different way, and that would be, in a way, a good step to try to move towards acceptance of who is different and what means also being different. So actually, this is an area where I think more research and more investment should be made to try to address some of the root causes behind the lack of integration. Let me close. It's been maybe a bit long, but with some considerations of my also working methods and the things we do. Because the situation is so polarized, one of the things that I find very useful is to rely on the work mainly of my predecessors, even though I'm continuing this work myself, who sat down and look at best practices, lessons learned, and try to develop advice on integration policies broadly, looking both at, how can I say, broad strategies, and also some policies in certain sectors. And what can we advise to our countries in terms of successful integration, models of integration? And so they came up with a number of recommendations or guidelines that we are offering to the countries, and that I'm using myself as a kind of a technical blueprint to depoliticize what I do. And so when the Ukrainians and the Hungarians say, I want this, I want that, I pull out my book and say, this is what we would like to see, because this is what we recommend. And so you should try to move towards that and try to move away from this narrative of acquired rights versus building the identity of the country. And we have two sets of broad recommendations. One are the Ljubljana recommendations on integration of societies and focusing on diversities. And this is a menu, but I would say in a rather inclusive menu of all the steps and all the areas that need to be part of a policy that results into promoting better integration of societies by upholding the rights of minorities, but also looking at what are the comprehensive policies that are needed. And the second is the Bolzano-Bozen, and we had a few months ago celebrated the anniversary of this, but also organized an event around this, that have to do with the interstate relationship in relation to minorities. And Bolzano-Bozen is an obvious example of two countries that have a stake in a minority, where the notion that the country that has the sovereignty is the country that has the responsibility and has to, in a way, shape the policies that allow this minority to preserve its own identity while being progressively integrated, even though Bolzano-Bozen, we have to see the long-term impact would need at some point to be reviewed. But still the model works, and the situation, there were security problems, they've gone away, so from a conflict prevention perspective, this has worked. From others, it has worked a bit less. But so this manual also describes what are the steps that are allowed to the so-called king state. Often we see these policies, actually there is a debate also here in Bolzano on passportization of minorities. So if this happens massively and systematically, this can create instability. If this happens episodically, it's not a problem. So also it's also an issue of measure and method in many cases. And then we have a number of sectorial recommendations. One is on education. This was the first recommendation, the Hague recommendations in late 90s. One on language, the Oslo recommendation. We looked at them last year in Oslo. There was the anniversary. The Lund recommendations on inclusion, participation of minorities in their society. Because, of course, what we want to ensure through integration is that the members of the minorities then are full part of the life of the country where they live. So they are, to go back to the Hungarians, not like the Hungarians studying Hungarian language, and then once they have a degree, they go back to Hungary or come to Europe to do something else. They will never look at Kiev as their place for the future, and that, of course, has to change. So Lund, we will celebrate this year the anniversary, and look at successes and good models and review in a way these recommendations. But the idea is to ensure that there is inclusion in every area, political field, in the administration, the economy. When representatives of minorities are everywhere, the example for Alto Adige, Südtirol would be Lily Gruber. You know, when you have people that are well known and they are part of the society, part of the system, they are not discriminated because of the ethnic origin, that is a sign of success. And then we have some more sectorial recommendations, for instance, on policing, on access to justice. Rule of law is always a very important area. A country's success is often measured also on the perception that the members of the society have of the justice in the rule of law area. It's very visible if the police is selective. And just think of the United States, some of the debates we see there sometimes. And if the police treats one part of the society in a different way than another part of the society, then there is a problem. And the same is justice. It's even worse in a way. Maybe it's less visible on the cameras, but it's worse when it comes to the substance. So these recommendations, in fact, do address these issues. I can give you an example of a place in Kyrgyzstan, where in South Kyrgyzstan, in Central Asia, we had unrest years ago. There was a major crisis there due to the Uzbek community that at some point revolted. In fact, it was kept rather segregated there, but they had a good ability to develop economically. So there were tensions between the communities, and these tensions suddenly erupted. and created a major crisis. The OSCE intervened. We had a police operation for a long time. I went there recently and look at the situation, which is calm, but there's still some elements of tension there. But look at the police. And the police is totally ethnic Kyrgyz. And they are policing Uzbek neighborhoods. So I went to see the Minister of Interior and I said, you really need to make an effort to have multi-ethnic policing. If you have Uzbek policemen, first of all, you'll have better intelligence of what's going on there from your own immediate perspective. But also there will be a sense that the police, that everybody is part of the police, that they are part of the country. They are not subjects of special scrutiny just because they are Uzbeks. They have to feel they have access to every part of your structure. And so these are the things that we want to project with these recommendations. We have another one on minorities and media that goes also back to the 90s. It's important also to make sure the minorities have their space in the media, both in terms of transmissions and broadcasts in their own languages, certain quotas, certain airspace, but also their active engagement in this. But now we're redoing them, taking into account the strong evolution of the whole media sector. So we're looking at the digital media and minorities. What is the impact when you can have also digital media, especially social media, potentially playing a role of how can I say, strengthening the discourse of certain groups and certain like-minded groups and contributing to marginalization of minorities or complicating in a way their integration. So we need to monitor that too. So these are examples of the tools that we have. You will find, all if you're interested, there is a website, our website. In the OSCE website, you look for High Commissioner National Minorities, and then on that page you click, and then you find all these recommendations in English and some of the other OSCE languages. I think I'll leave it at here. I apologize if it was a bit long. I hope it was of interest to you, and I'm happy also to discuss with you any issues you may be interested in. We can. There's so much that I could move in any direction in much more detail, of course. But so I picked here and there a few things to stimulate in a way your thoughts. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. This touched upon a number of key issues for the school and gave us a sense of the actual work of an international organization, which at times we are unable to convey in our classes. This gave us the real life of an international institution. So I'm sure there will be questions from students or colleagues. Yeah, could.
Hi, good morning. Andrea Carla from Iraq Research in Bolzano, Institute of Minority Rights. I have two questions, if I might. The first question regarding the concept you presented. Thanks, really interesting presentation, by the way, really good. You actually already answered some of my questions I came here today, but you mentioned that you resolve the need to find a balance between protecting minorities and conflict prevention, which is the main mandate of the organization, with this concept, strategy, or gradual process of integration society. I get the feeling sometimes dealing with minorities, as a delegation of minorities coming to Iraq, that sometimes, on the one hand, minorities don't really, this strategy doesn't really fit with the goal of minority themselves. I think they want more like a fast process of protection more than a gradual process of integration. On the other hand, you have the state, and they have different needs and goals, geostrategic goals. So my question is, under what conditions you see this strategy of the High Commission can be successful or has been successful? If you can kind of give us an idea of this condition when it's the same way with the guidance, under what condition it is like the Ljubljana guidelines actually are really accepted. How does it work? And can I have a second question, or should I wait for later?
Perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, I was mention. As you know, I mean, we have many delegations of minorities coming to research to study South Tirol model. It's not that they just come to South Tirol; they come to other places that have been successful in dealing with ethnic tensions. And I get the feeling sometimes the lesson they get coming to South Tirol is not exactly sometimes proper in the sense. If you think about education, you know, the school education system in South Tirol is not what you are arguing today for. It's a separate school system. So I was wondering, how do you cope with this dynamic where minorities delegation go around to look for themselves for best practice, and they get what they want from this best practice more than looking at the guidelines of the High Commission?
I can answer these, and then we can continue with others. Yeah. On the first point, I try to avoid, conflict prevention. First of all, in itself is very tricky, because when you're successful in conflict prevention, nothing happens. So whether whether this is the result of your action, or whether this is just the way it would have been anyhow, who knows? So what is important is that you engage on issues and you see some progress on the issues themselves, and that progress will improve in a way the overall situation and will make the crisis of the conflict less likely. I don't think you ever manage to engage in a way, and with there may be some exceptions, but it's difficult to engage in a way that say, I solved the problem and now the conflict is not going to happen. So if you make some progress, you can measure it, you can describe it. That's part of my, and I'm trying to make this public also. The reports of High Commissioners to Permanent Council in the past were often confidential. I'm trying to make them all public, so you can also look on the website of the OSCE and see what I'm telling the Permanent Council in terms of things I'm doing. And I'm broadening also in a way, the field of my engagement. I was in October. I went to the United States, which usually our commissioners go there. The U.S. is a key member of the OSCE, of course, but they usually go there to talk about everything else and everybody else. This time I went there, yes, also to talk about some of the things I'm doing and to ask for support, but also to look at what's going on in the United States. And I had meetings with the civil society there, and I started asking questions because I see increasing divisions in the society. So I feel it's my job to engage. I should have said that I'm also trying to stay away from the definition of minorities, which is a problem with a number of countries who say you should stick to your mandate and deal with what we tell you are minorities and don't deal with the ones we tell you are not minorities. And we have a number of countries in the OSCE who say we have no minorities. I could give you a list of very significant countries in the OSCE that have no minorities because it's written in the constitution, because whatever. So I really try to move away of it as much as I can and to act in practice. And going sectorial helps me, and this is one of the things, protection. It's exactly the way you put it. Sometimes countries are surprised when I discuss with them issues of minorities, and they say, your policy concerning that minority is too generous, and you're creating a problem, and you're creating a problem of segregation. And for instance, I had this, and I'm discussing this with the Spanish government. We are discussing that, we might organize an event on education in Spain, because I told them in Catalonia, and it's not a minority, that's the first thing they said. They said, no, I've never said that they're a minority. But there's a problem of segregation in education, and so we are addressing these issues. And I think you need to try to fix that problem. And we can help you with our best practices in a way, because our best practices are not in a way advocating that model. And the same applies here. I'm treading very carefully, being Italian myself. I don't want to engage directly in the problems of the Alto Adige Sud Tirol. But my impression, in fact, is what you're saying, is that in the field of education, there is segregation, and students who study in German speaking education systems then tend to continue their studies in Austria and Germany somewhere else and not in Italy. So this is not healthy in terms of long-term integration of the society there. And in my view, it should be relooked at. But as I say, I want to tread very carefully in this. But the issue of using that as a model, I know that they're going to schools in the Ladin-speaking areas where there is a better level of integration of languages in the curriculum. But still, and perhaps I will come to Europe to have a discussion of that and see whether we can improve the way we're doing things. Sometimes it's the Italians themselves. For instance, we sent a group of Moldovans to Alto Adige, Sud Tirol recently, and this was promoted by the Italian embassy in Chisinau, who wanted to showcase the Sud Tirol as a very good model, and maybe we ought to say something in that context.
Other questions, students, colleagues? Luisa Antonioli, or perhaps
students first.
Students first. If there are questions, do not hesitate.
I'm not biting, you know.
Okay. So we have two colleagues indeed. So Luisa Antonioli, former director of the School of International Studies, professor of comparative law.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think this is somehow related to what you just mentioned, and it's a curiosity about how do you see the issue of kind of one size fits all. That is, in some sense, you were recalling the fact that in your guidelines you have benchmarks or proposals or ideas that could be applied in different contexts, but at the same time, in your analysis and also the cases that you mentioned, it's clear that the local condition and context is so crucial in finding a solution. So I'm very interested in getting your sense, by having worked so long in practical experience, on how much you can not theorize, but at least have models that can be used, or whether at the end of the day you need to be deeply embedded in the specificities of each case and there's no single way of handling things.
It's the latter. It's good to have a blueprint and to have an idea what should be the objectives, first of all, and what are the possible recommendations and methods. But you need to sit down to have a good understanding of local culture. I've seen attempts to bring ready-made models that work in some place and transpose them somewhere else, and it regularly fails. So you need to have local ownership. You need to bring the expertise and advice. You need to make sure that the advice are flexible enough to understand. They need to adjust to local culture, traditions. I was mentioning Central Asia. Central Asia, you really need to understand the mentality, the logic, the history, the culture there to be able to develop models that are working.
Can I ask you, do you use any indicators, or is, do you make use of indicators or indexes, or is something that
yes, but it's very time consuming. So we have to, especially, you know, when we have projects and we have donors want to have a clear indication of the progress achieved, etc. So we have a system of KPIs and performance indicators that show in a way what has been achieved. But I tend to, in a way, focus more on, as they say in technical language, on outputs than on outcomes, just to see what has been done. And then you step back and then you look at how everything develops and see if it is right, see if it's this is pushback. There is one thing that I didn't mention because, you know, there are so many. But I got invited last May by the Swiss, who had the chairmanship of the OSCE years earlier, to an event in Africa on prevention of genocide. And I went down with my Ljubljana guidelines, and I said, you know, genocide often goes back to interethnic strife in the societies, etc. So you need to work on integrating the societies. Even if it's tribal divisions, etc., there are policies that can be applied. And I presented this, and they were fascinated. They were saying, we never thought there could be, in a way, blueprints, models, recommendations, etc. And so we ended up organizing an event in New York, in the margins of the General Assembly, on conflict prevention, focusing on divisions in the society. Because if you think well, there are no more interstate conflicts. Conflicts also come internally to states. They feed on divisions in the society. They can be political, can be economic, can be ethnic, can be of any kind. They are used by external players, proxies, etc. But this is the new nature of conflict. So if you want to be effective in conflict prevention, and conflict prevention, unfortunately, is still based on the logic of interstate conflict, you need to refocus on this new kind of source of conflicts, which is internal to states. And then these recommendations become really useful. So there were some concerns in New York because of also my title. You know, I brought the minority issue to the fore, and in the UN it's a very difficult topic to discuss. But I really focused the event on integration and conflict prevention and tried to put the minorities on the back and sort of hide them somewhere. And there was interest, and the Secretary General invited me to go back and do it again and try to get even more visibility to this debate. So in fact, and this is obviously if it's Africa, none of our models will apply as such, but a number of things we do can be of interest to them. They can look at them, how can these things be reinterpreted in their own environment? And one of them told me, you know, even if one of our leaders wanted to engage and to invest in a strong policy of integration of the society, wouldn't know where to start from. So to have a kind of a set of recommendations could inspire him and could inspire his policies.
I think we have the time for one last question or two.
Can I go?
Yeah,
sorry.
Elena
Can I
Fasoli
go
from the
first?
School of Law. She teaches international law. You have
the floor.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So it was super interesting. Thank you so much. You made a lot of super important statements. For example, that we have this tendency to have deals nowadays instead of coherent strategies. Very much, I agree with you. The fact that, as you mentioned, there are laws that are not passing because they are not patriotic enough. You mentioned that there was the example in Ukraine. We have global problems, we need shared strategies, and yet society is actually pushing back, you said many times, right? And at the same time, they're pushing back also, especially with regard to integration, for example. But at the same time, you also refer to the role of education that you reflect in your speech. And the fact that it should also be given the role to the young generation, the young people, as part of the solution of the problem. But I'm wondering, who is the society then who is pushing back and being so against integration? Because also young people, they're part of society at the same time.
Yes.
And the reason why I'm asking you this, which is also a provocative question, of course, is because when I was living in the UK during the Brexit referendum situation, there was a huge clash between the younger generation that actually they voted in and the older generation that they voted out, as to be like back into the old times, so no more integration because actually we didn't like it so much. So actually let's push back, let's go back to the previous time. So what do you think about this society pushing back and being against the integration? Thanks.
It's a matter of leadership, and unfortunately we are really in dire lack of good leadership today. Partly, and it's a vicious circle, because the leadership we have is the leadership imposed by the society who is resisting change in a way. And so there is no easy answer to that. There is really no easy answer. Being populist or demagogic today is a kind of a winning card, or weak leaders. And I don't want to pass judgment on leadership in the UK today. But the whole Brexit thing, looking at it from outside, is how can I say, beyond the decision, also the implementation is really messy. What can I say? Investing, and I'm calling for more investment in multilaterals, is certainly one of the ways. but sometimes these calls fall on deaf ears. What can we do? We can only keep talking about it and reaching out. These are the messages, and you are the recipients of the messages. So I think let's help each other. I'll try from my perspective to do as much as I can in also spreading this kind of messages. And I think every one of us has an opportunity, the possibility to move in that direction if you believe it. And let's try to build stronger societies, more resilient to the big challenges we have in front of us. I'm sorry, but more than that is really difficult.
I think, is there another one, or a quick one, or? Yeah, can we?
Sure.
Can we?
Sure.
Yeah. This from.
Thanks for touching the issue on, or talking about South Tyrol. I am from South Tyrol, Alto Adige, and so it's really interesting to me. Well, I noticed that bilingualism and integration works better, for sure, in cities, like for example Merano and Bolzano, than in the valleys, where there's much more. It's harder. There are more German parts, and it's not so bilinguistic than in the cities, in the centers. And yeah, maybe to avoid conflict, it would be a great opportunity to study the autonomies on national level, because we so often have we have all Italian regions looked at our region maybe in a hostile or skeptical manner, because they just don't know our history, our culture, and so they come and say, we're in Italy, and why don't they speak Italian? And that's maybe a problem, because they just don't know the history, the reasons, and nothing. And usually people who try to be skeptical and hostile towards something which tends to be wants to be not divided, but a bit special or segregated. And so for sure it would help if we would have all Italian regions, or just maybe in schools or something, teaching also our history. Because in our region we already know, and we try to have a nice living with Germans and Italians and Latins. But it's the new thing is then you get always the Italians from, well, I'm myself Italian for sure, but you get the tourists from all the regions, and you say, okay, now you have to explain why we have been Austrian, a bit Tyrolean in history and all this stuff, and so you say you start from zero. And that's hard, maybe.
Soll ich auf Deutsch beantworten, oder?
Ja, so gerne.
Maybe a couple of points there, and I first of all I have to say I'm not really an expert on South Tyrol beyond the mountains, which I know pretty well and I like. But I think the Italians, once the agreement was made and everything was in place, and the system was in place, thought this is working fine. That's it. And they kind of there's no critical review of how things are going. It's working well. Mainly, one of the things you were saying, the economy is going well. So when the economy goes well, everything becomes easier in a way, and so that's fine. But then the second thing, and I would like to go back to the discussion we had on education. There is maybe a need to relook at things, but also there with a sense of balance. We are saying that there are obligations and rights on all sides. So I would like to see in that region Italians learning better German, and probably German speakers learning better Italian. So one should try to look in a balanced way at the system and see what needs to be improved to improve the degree of integration of the communities. You say in the cities this is going better in a way, but without giving the impression that we're focusing only on one group. Integration, and I never talk about integration of minorities, I talk about integration of societies, because integration is a global process that involves every part, every component of the society. So my perception, and still with this caveat of not being an expert, and I have not visited the region under my mandate, so I have not focused on the things there. But taking at some point a critical reassessment of how things are going, and how well all communities are integrated, how well also people are part of the society and have challenges, etc. was mentioned Lily Gruber. I would like to see more examples of high-level German-speaking people from the province there in various parts of administration. In politics, you tend to see the SVP, but it's kind of and we have, in some countries, we have similar models of basically reserved seats for representatives of minorities who have a very specific political agenda. Sometimes it's good also to have people who are part of mainstreaming parties and they embed their agenda in the political agenda of a larger party without having to seek a coalition. So these are examples that I don't know how feasible they are, but in theory one should also try to get that sort of result. So there are models and there may be ideas what could work on. The issue is there political will? Is this high on the agenda? I suspect in this moment it would be difficult to make a priority for this given what everything else that is going on in this country. But certainly one of the things I can tell you that at some point I will come with discretion, because given that I'm Italian, I should pay attention on how I engage on issues that are related to my home country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We want to look with confidence to future generations, so we proudly proceed to the delivery of the parchments to our students who graduated. This is an official moment at the end of this great lecture. Thank you very much again. So now I ask the coordinator of the PhD, right? Do we start with the PhD? Yeah, I have been told we start with the PhD, so okay. So takes a while, and we continue with this.
Devo leggere solo leggere o sì, devo leggere, mi servono le mani.